Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a little trip. So dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan, get cozy, but not too cozy. Because this isn't one of those soft fairy tales with tea and castles and warm bread. No, this is a slow descent into the boiling, bubbling, brain-melting nightmare that was the daily life of a medieval candle maker, and you lucky viewer are about to become one. But first, if you enjoy weird history, slow storytelling, and accidentally learning things while falling asleep, to the smell of mental collapse and cow grease, go ahead and like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments when you're listening. Are you working late, drifting off to sleep, hiding from your children, or just wondering what burnt tallow smells like? Because tonight, we're diving nose first into the sensory horror of pre-electric Europe. And spoiler alert, it reeks. So congratulations, you are now a professional candle maker in the heart of a medieval town. The year is something like 1294 or 1312. Or honestly, it doesn't matter. Because nothing has changed in 200 years. The only constant in your life is wax, wax, and more wax. And that's just the surface. Underneath it all is a gnawing dread and an overwhelming stench that never goes away. Not even when you sleep, which by the way isn't really sleep. More like periodic unconsciousness wrapped in grease-stained linen and interrupted every hour by rats. You wake up not to an alarm clock, but to a wet thump, followed by the distinct smell of something dead under the floorboards. Maybe a mouse, maybe something worse. But you don't have time to investigate because your bed is already yelling at your spine. It's made from something you suspect used to be straw, but now resembles a fermented nest of mold moths and your regrets. And yes, you sleep above your workshop because real estate is expensive and hell is other people's wax, so your bedroom is just the top floor of your candle operation, complete with smoke-stained rafters, dripping ceilings and walls that trap heat in the summer and curses in the winter. And the first thing you notice, besides the smell of your own armpits fermenting under 2 layers of scratchy wool, is the taste of the air. It's heavy, greasy, and vaguely beefy, as if someone steamed a medieval stew, forgot about it, then tried to reheat it using only candle flames and desperation. And speaking of desperation, your chamber pot is full again, because hauling it down 2 flights of stairs in the middle of the night is dangerous and humiliating. And one time you did it and slipped on a fat glob and didn't walk straight for a week. So now it just sits by the corner like a loyal, reeking companion. And as you rise to start your day, your joints protest like a peasant rebellion. Your fingers crack, your knees groan, and your back sounds like someone stepping on a bundle of twigs. You stretch immediately, regret it, and then stumble over to the rickety ladder that leads down to the workshop. You descend like a waxy phantom already sweating, because your one window is permanently shut to keep out thieves' bats and the judgmental gaze of passing monks. You reach the bottom and inhale the thick stew of your profession, smoke pig-fat resin, and the faint aroma of defeat. Your workshop is not a place of inspiration. It is a dungeon with tools filled with the ghosts of projects gone wrong. Half-melted candle stumps, cracked molds, and a pile of candle trimmings that may or may not be moving. You light the first flame of the day, not with reverence, but with a wheezy sigh. And as the match flares and catches, you remember that you forgot to make more matches again. So now you're down to 3, which means today better go well, or you'll be rubbing flint like a caveman at midnight The wax you'll be using this morning comes from a blend of sheep tallow and leftover fat from the butcher, which he sells you at a discount, because even the dogs don't want it, and you dump it into the melting pot with the care of someone who knows that one wrong splash means second-degree burns and an afternoon explaining to the guild why you now look like a melting candle yourself. You stir the fat with a crooked wooden paddle that used to be a spoon, then a ruler, then a fly swatter, and now it's just part of you. You don't wash it anymore because what's the point? And as the tallow bubbles and pops releasing clouds of thick, eye-watering steam, you eat your breakfast, a crust of old rye bread dipped in lukewarm beer, and dream of a world with eggs or fruit, or even dignity. But those things are for merchants and clerics. Not you. You're a fat alchemist, a light maker, a human chimney, and your only companion is the groaning beam above your head and the occasional thud from the attic rats dragging something they probably shouldn't be dragging. You pull on your apron stiff with old wax and memories of burns past, and begin to prepare the molds they are made of, iron and sorrow, and each one has its own personality, mostly bad ones. One is always crooked, one leaks and one spits back molten wax like it's possessed. You line them up anyway because you need today's quota, or the guild will fine you in candles, and you're already in candle debt. Yes, that's a real thing like student loans, but with more grease as you ladle the first scoop of molten tallow into the mold. You feel the splash on your wrist. It sizzles, you hiss, and then you keep going. Because what are you going to do? Cry no, you're a professional. And besides, you don't have enough tears left in your body for crying anymore. You pour and pour and pour each mold, absorbing another piece of your soul. And all the while the smoke thickens, the light dims, and the smell of seared animal lingers like an unwanted guest. Welcome to your life now, a stew of fire fat and slow-brewing madness. And if you think this is bad, if you think waking up in a rancid wax dungeon, feeding a fire that hates you, and blistering your hands before breakfast is somehow the worst part, just wait, because the real horror is only beginning. There is no breakfast, not really, unless you count gnawing on the corner of yesterday's bread until your jaw aches, and your teeth feel like they've sanded themselves down to the gums. And even then, the bread is so dense it might qualify as construction material, more mortar than meal. But you chew anyway, because chewing is the only thing you have control over right now. And it keeps your jaw busy, while your brain screams in protest against the reality of the morning. Your morning routine is not a collection of refreshing rituals, but a slow-motion plunge into the exact same nightmare you woke up from, except now you're upright and sweating. Welcome to the tallow fog, a scented mist of despair made from boiling sheep fat, goat fat, pig fat, basically anything that used to have a face, and now lives in barrels stacked in a corner of your workshop. And let's talk about those barrels for a moment. They're not sealed, not really, more like loosely covered with a rotten board and an optimistic prayer. And every morning you peel one open and greet the flies like old co-workers. They're already awake, already buzzing, already dipping their filthy little feet into your wax supply. And you don't swat them anymore because you've accepted that they live here now. They're part of the process. Just like the mold that grows on the wall above the tallow pot. Just like the splinters in your palms from the wood. That's never been plain, just like the burns that now map your arms, like a constellation of regret. Today's wax is especially pungent. Probably something to do with the summer heat, making the fat congeal in strange, meaty ways. and the texture is somewhere between stew and nightmare soup. So you chop it with a cleaver, because yes, part of your job is literally chopping fat into chunks, like a medieval butcher of sadness. And once it's in the pot, you stand there paddle in hand, stirring slowly, while the heat rises in greasy waves around your face. Your eyes start to sting, but you don't blink. Blinking wastes time, and time means mistakes. And mistakes mean pain. You learned that last week when you spilled hot tallow on your foot and had to finish the day limping on a raw blister the size of an egg. No shoes, of course. Just sandals with too much character and not enough soul. And while you stir, you think about things weird. Things like how your life smells permanently, like burning livestock, or how you haven't felt clean since last harvest, or how every joint in your body now makes a sound when you move. Not a sharp crack, more like a creak, like an old door in a haunted monastery. And speaking of monasteries, a monk passed by your stall once and made the sign of the cross. Not out of piety, but because your candle smoke looked a little too sentient that day. You laugh about it now, kind of. Because what else are you going to do? Cry into the tallow season it. With your grief, stir in your regret and make grief. Candles for funerals that smell faintly of despair and pig bones. The fat bubbles, you stir. The paddle scrapes the pot, and outside the world begins to stir too. The market square waking up with the sound of carts creaking, chickens screaming for reasons unknown, and apprentices being yelled at by people who used to be apprentices, and are now slightly older apprentices, with more resentment and less patience. You inhale the air thick with smoke and ammonia, and something that might be burning hair. Yours probably, and you realize your stomach is turning, not from hunger, but from existing inside this scented coffin of your own making. The heat sticks to your clothes, which are never really dry, just different shades of damp, and your shirt is crusted with last week's wax, hardened like armor, but completely useless for protection. You scrape a glob off and toss it aside, where it lands with a wet plop next to a pile of failed candles. Candles that bent too early, or cracked too wide, or melted in the wrong direction. You don't throw them out because they're still technically usable, which in your world means not on fire and sort of shaped like a stick. You wipe your forehead with the back of your hand and taste salt and soot and a hint of ash. And that's when you realize that your left eye has been twitching since before dawn. Not a big twitch, just a subtle, maddening flutter, like your eyelid is trying to send Morse code to God and you don't know what it's saying. But it probably translates to, "Please end me." You look around the workshop and everything is coated in a film of grease. The walls, the floor, your tools, even the candles themselves, they shimmer with the soft glow of despair. And as you begin to pour the first molds of the day, carefully, always carefully, because hot wax does not forgive you, feel the heat radiating from the tin, like the judgment of 1,000 saints. Your fingers slip, a drop lands on your skin, and you hiss through your teeth like you've done 1,000 times before. It blisters instantly, but you keep going, because the pain is familiar now, expected like an old friend who visits just to ruin your day. And by the time the last mold is filled, you're dizzy, your arms ache and your head is pounding. A slow throb that matches the beat of the dripping wax. And for a moment you wonder if this is how madness begins, with routine repetition, smoke and heat, with waking up each day to stir the same pot of liquefied animal ghosts and breathing in the same oily air, until you forget what fresh smells like, what clean feels like, what anything tastes like that wasn't touched by wax or soot or bitterness. You sit down for a moment just to rest your feet, and your bones sigh in relief, as if they've been begging you for mercy since sunrise. But there's no mercy here, not in this workshop, not in this job, not in this century. You glance at the window where a shaft of sunlight tries to sneak in past the soot-streaked glass, and it looks wrong, like light doesn't belong here, like it's an intruder in the land of permanent dusk. You close your eyes just for a second and the darkness feels familiar, almost comfortable. And that's when you know something inside you has shifted. You're not just tired anymore. You're becoming something else. Something waxy and brittle and permanently singed. And if you think your morning routine couldn't get any worse, well, guess what? You haven't even opened the fly room yet. You always knew you were becoming the job, but today confirms it. You are the candle. You are the wax. You are the melted refuse of your own labor, and nothing can change that now. Not after months or maybe years of breathing in fumes that smell like boiled despair and tanning grease. Your skin doesn't feel like skin anymore. It feels like cured leather that's been dipped in animal fat and shame. Your clothes hang off you, not like garments, but like stiff paper soaked in oil. Everything you wear has hardened into an inflexible crust that bends at odd angles and scrapes when you walk. But you keep wearing it because laundry is a fantasy. And besides, the last time you tried to wash anything, it just smeared the grease around like sadness. Jam, your fingernails are yellowed and ridged from constant exposure to soot and tallow. And God knows what kind of airborne death particles you've inhaled since the summer of that really bad batch of lard at your hair has fused into a helmet of smoke and wax, and maybe ash, and your scalp itches so much you've started scratching in your sleep. Which wouldn't be so bad if it didn't result in bleeding and little black specks on your pillow that may or may not be lice. You stopped checking weeks ago because honestly, you'd rather not know. Ignorance is your new bedtime routine, and even when you try to clean yourself, it doesn't work. You once spent half a day boiling water and rubbing down with old soap made from lye and goat bone, and all it did was leave you pink raw and somehow smellier like steamed meat left on a windowsill in July. And no matter how much you scrub, your arms still feel tacky like the inside of a candle mold that hasn't set yet. And your feet, oh, your poor feet trapped in cracked leather shoes lined with wool that used to be white, but now looks like it survived a grease fire. Every step is a squelch, a squish, a reminder that nothing in your life is truly dry anymore. You are a moisture event in a human shape. And when you walk down the narrow alley behind your shop to toss yesterday's candle stubs into the communal wax pile, a hill of rejects and burnouts and misfires, you catch your reflection in the cracked window of the cooper's shed, and you barely recognize yourself. Not because your features have changed, but because you look like a failed experiment in turning sadness into a person. Your eyes are sunken and your mouth is chapped and your whole posture screams underpaid. The worst part is you used to be proud of this work. There was a time you believed in light, in warmth, in the sacred act of creating something that burned beautifully in the dark. But now, when you light a candle, you mostly wonder how fast it would take to catch your sleeve on fire, and whether the pain would register before the relief. And speaking of pain, your joints crack again as you reach for a crate of beeswax, the good stuff, the expensive stuff, the stuff reserved for noble candles and church orders. It's sweet-smelling and smooth and full of promise, unlike you. But as you try to lift it, your back seizes up like a door slammed shut by an angry ghost, and you freeze in place, half-bent teeth, clenched lips twitching, and you stay like that for a moment, stuck between movement and collapse until your spine gives up and lets you rise a little crooked, a little more broken, and you carry the wax back into the workshop, where it will be melted and molded and twisted and trimmed just like you. And while the beeswax simmers gently in its little copper pot, filling the air with a smell that's almost pleasant, like flowers seen through smoke, you try not to breathe too deeply because deep breaths trigger coughing, and your cough is not the dry, polite kind, but the deep, wet, medieval kind that sounds like you swallowed a toad and is trying to crawl back out. You spit something into a rag and don't look at it. You haven't looked in weeks, and just as you're pouring the wax into the pristine church molds, you hear the bell from across the square ring. Noon, which would be exciting if time meant anything anymore. But for you, it just means halfway to more pain. And you glance at your hand and realize there's a fresh blister forming where yesterday's burn cracked open again. It oozes slightly, and you wipe it on your apron without thinking, because the apron is already a crime scene. And you laugh a little too loud, a little too long, and it echoes in the workshop in a way that makes even the rats go quiet. You stop laughing, light another test candle, watch the flame twitch in the greasy air, and whisper to it without knowing why. Maybe it's the fumes, maybe it's the isolation, maybe you've crossed the line between hard worker and local legend. The kind of figure kids whisper about, the greasy ghoul of Candle Alley, the light breather, the fat witch, the tallow ghost who lives alone and never sleeps. And the worst part is, you wouldn't even blame them. Because every day your body becomes more candle than person, softening at the edges, prone to leaks marked by scars and stubs and smoke. And if this sounds like a tragedy, don't worry. It's not because tragedy requires dignity, and you left that behind when you slipped on pig grease last month and cracked your chin on the soapstone floor. So now it's just routine ritual wax in, wax out, a slow transformation from living creature to half-melted relic. And if you think you've reached the bottom of the barrel, if you think it can't get more absurd, more grotesque, more uniquely disgusting, well, get ready, because it's almost time for labour inspection hour, and your apprentice just screamed from the fly room. You don't have a lunch break. That's a myth reserved for people who sell pies or bread or morals. You just have moments where your body fails faster than your ambition, and you sit down because it's either that or collapse face first into the wax vat. But today, you don't even get that luxury because the morning pour has begun, and you're already 3 orders behind thanks to last night's candle batch, deciding it would rather curl like demon horns than stand upright. And now, your workshop smells like remorse and smoked toenails, and you're holding a sloshing ladle of molten tallow, like it's a gift from the gods, when really it's just another opportunity for third-degree enlightenment. The molds are lined up on the table, like blunt iron coffins, waiting to be filled with the fatty residue of dead animals and bad decisions. And you work in silence because there's nothing left to say. Not to your apprentice who left last month. Not to the new boy who doesn't speak since the accident with the beeswax vat. Not to the flies who are the only consistent company in this room. You've named 3 of them. They've outlived your last assistant. You tip the ladle forward, and the hot fat flows like sadness incarnate. Thick, slow bubbling slightly as it hits the cool tin, and every drop hisses with a voice that says, "This is your life now," and you agree with it silently because disagreeing would require energy, and you're saving that for tonight's panic attack. The morning pour is the most important part of the day, not because it's sacred, but because if you mess it up now, the whole afternoon is just damage control, a game of scraping out mistakes and pretending they were intentional, like when a mold leaks and you say it's artisanal, or when the wick slips sideways and you call it a prayer curve. But there's no room for creativity now. Not when the church has ordered 50 straight columns for the feast of Saint Wash's name, and the merchant's wife wants 3 dozen dinner tapers that match the colour of pale lavender, with a hint of smug, and your tools are not cooperating. Your ladle handle is sticky with a glue made from sweat and tallow. Your mold clamps are rusted from last winter's flood. And your gloves, oh wait, you don't have gloves, because gloves are for people with coin or foresight, or working nerve endings. You've got bare hands, and a hope that your calluses hold up one more time, so you move from mold to mold with the rhythm of someone who stopped thinking years ago and just operates on candle time. Now your muscles know the motion, even if your brain has checked out to think about soup or warmth, or how your left thumb looks slightly paler than yesterday, like maybe it's dying too, and the wax sloshes, the molds fill the room, steams with the stink of rendered death, and every breath is a gamble between dizziness, nausea, or brief unconsciousness, but you keep going because someone has to. And that someone is always you, the candle mule, the fat whisperer, the one who turns butcher scraps into flickering holiness, and halfway through the pour, you realize you haven't blinked. In what feels like an hour, your eyes sting, your neck cramps, and you force yourself to exhale. Just so you remember how lungs work outside. You hear the church bells marking mid-morning, and for a second you imagine running toward them, dropping your ladle and sprinting into the sun like a man reborn. But then you remember the last time you stepped into daylight. Your skin almost hissed, and your neighbor's dog barked at you like you were a greasy demon from the underworld. So instead, you keep pouring slowly, steadily, until the molds are filled and you can slide them aside to cool their slick sides, dripping a little from the heat, and you sit back on the edge of the workbench breathless, not because you're tired though you are, but because there's a weird buzzing in your ears that makes it hard to tell if you're hearing real sounds or just the wax boiling into your blood. And just as you consider checking your pulse, the door slams open, and in stumbles the apprentice, the new one, eyes wide, face pale, holding a cracked bucket of resin like it's cursed, which it might be because the fumes coming off it smell like a blend of pine sap vinegar and raw panic. And he tries to say something, but only manages a wheeze before he drops the bucket and spills half the contents onto the floor. And you watch in silent horror as the resin spreads across your workspace like a sticky, semi-sentient monster that plans to glue your shoes to the earth forever. And there's nothing you can do except sigh. Not a dramatic sigh, not an angry one, just the long, slow release of air that says, "Of course this happened. Of course this is my life." And you grab a rag drop to your knees and start scooping up the mess with your bare hands. Because that's what you do now. You clean up other people's accidents with your fingers, and a soul that's mostly wax. The resin clings to your skin like betrayal, and you know it'll never come off fully, that you'll be peeling tiny strings of it from your fingers for weeks, that your bed will stick to your hands tonight, and your dinner will taste faintly of regret and turpentine. And when the floor is somewhat clean, and the resin has stopped migrating. You look at the boy who caused it all, and you don't yell because yelling takes effort, and instead you just nod toward the door, and he gets the message. He leaves quietly, like someone slipping out of their own failed future, and you return to your molds now cooling in the corner, and you realize you've done all this before. Exactly this. The mess, the mistake, the recovery. And you'll do it again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. And suddenly, the idea of turning into a wax figure doesn't seem so far-fetched. You're halfway there already, just waiting for someone to light the wick. There's a certain kind of headache that only exists in medieval candle workshops. A pressure cooker pulse that starts in the back of your skull, moves forward like a marching army of regret, and settles behind your eyes, like molten stones. And you know, the cause isn't stress or dehydration, or even the fact that you've only eaten crusty bread and one pickled onion since dawn. No, this is a pure atmospheric headache, born from the thick, unrelenting stew of smells and smoke that hangs in the air like a curse you can't outrun. Your workshop is a cathedral of suffering, a tight little room of cracked stone and char-stained beams that traps every wisp of stink, like a holy relic, and the air itself is heavy, not metaphorically, but literally. You feel it pressing down on you with the density of old fat, hot iron, and burnt dreams. There's no chimney here, no airflow, just a window that you keep shut because when it's open, the wind messes with the flames, and the children outside shout things like grease ghost and meat wizard. And you don't need that kind of negativity in your life right now. Not when you're trying to maintain the illusion of control while surrounded by an olfactory assault that makes your eyes sting and your teeth ache. The worst offender today is the resin pot reheated from last week's batch, and now bubbling with a vengeance, releasing puffs of acrid vapor that somehow smell both acidic and sweet, like burnt molasses and urine-soaked pine needles. You try to ignore it, focusing instead on the wick-cutting table, where lengths of coarse hemp string wait to be snipped and dipped, snipped and dipped, a task so repetitive and mind-numbing that you often find yourself humming old plague songs under your breath without realizing it. And it's only when your nose starts bleeding slightly, not from injury, just from existing, that you pause to consider whether this is still normal, whether the constant exposure to fumes and smoke and melting bone goo might actually be rewiring your brain, because lately you've been forgetting small things, like which molds belong to which clients, or how long you've been standing in one place, or whether you've actually slept, or just laid down with your eyes open and dreamt about candles melting into your spine. You glance toward the back corner of the room where the beeswax sits, and for a second you swear you see it. Move, just a twitch, just a pulse, like it's breathing, and instead of screaming or running or even blinking, you just sigh and accept it, because that's who you are now. A man who sees sentient wax and says, "Yep," checks out and keeps working. You return to your wicks, snipping and sorting them into little bundles that you then hang from a wooden dowel above the fire to dry, a process that should take minutes, but always feels like hours, because the smoke from the fire makes your vision swim, and now the headache has blossomed into something more. Not just pressure, but heat. A searing wave that crashes behind your eyes and makes your temples throb with every heartbeat. You press your fingers to your forehead, but it doesn't help. Nothing. Helps not the cool cloth you soaked in the rain. Barrel last night. Not the sip of old mead you save for emergencies. Not the prayer you muttered to the wax saints whose melted faces still sit in a corner of your shop, looking vaguely horrified by everything you've become. And speaking of horror, you start coughing. Not a polite little throat clear, but a deep rattling hack that echoes off the stone walls like a dying animal. And with each cough comes the familiar metallic taste of soot, the sting of resin in your sinuses, the wheeze of lungs coated in candle smoke. You lean against the wall and wait for it to pass, your chest rising and falling like a broken bellows. And when it finally eases, you wipe your mouth and stare at the rag, half expecting it to come away, black. And honestly, it probably will tomorrow, and still you go back to work because there are orders to fill and quotas to meet. And nothing short of death or the tax collector can stop the great greasy grind of the candle trade. And just when you think you might catch a break, just when you think you might steal 5 minutes to sit and maybe pour water on your face and pretend you're somewhere else, the resin pot starts popping again, louder this time, with little explosive cracks that send flecks of tar flying into the air like spiteful little comets. One of them hits your cheek and you yelp more from shock than pain, because you've long since run out of nerves to damage, and you wipe it off with the back of your sleeve, which smears it into a black smear that now smells like scorched hair. And that's when you realize it's your own hair, because the edge of your hood is slightly singed and your scalp is warmer than usual. But again, you don't panic. You don't even react. You just accept it. Another quiet indignity added to the tower of filth and frustration that is your daily life. And the headache pulses stronger now, like the heartbeat of some old god trapped in your skull. And you wonder briefly if it's possible to die from a smell, because if so, this is probably the one that does it. Not rot or smoke or filth, but this unique blend of half-melted despair and chemical warfare that is the essence of resin plus heat, plus you stagger a little steady yourself against the wick table and force a smile, because sometimes smiling keeps the madness at bay, or at least tricks the flies into thinking you're not about to scream. And as you go to dip the next wick, your hands trembling slightly, you realize that you haven't seen the new apprentice in hours, and that's never a good sign. And before you can call out, you hear a quiet, wet sound from the back room, like something squelching its way across the floor, and you take a deep breath, or try to. But your lungs seize up again, and your headache finally surges forward like a tidal wave. And you think, not for the first time, that maybe this is it. Maybe this is the day you finally collapse mid-wick face down in the wax, immortalized in grease. And wouldn't that be a poetic end to a life spent breathing fire without ever seeing the sun? You've stopped checking the time because it doesn't matter anymore. Not when the sun is just a vague rumor filtered through soot-caked windows and your body runs on a strange clock powered by pain and muscle memory, and the faint whisper of hallucinations that might be dreams or might be symptoms. At this point, it's hard to tell. All you know is the candle molds have cooled enough to be released, and that means it's time to see which ones survived the journey from tallow to light, and which ones cracked or leaned or sagged, like disappointed relatives at a family dinner. You move slowly now, not out of laziness, but because your limbs have taken on that damp, heavy stiffness of clothes left too long in a river, and every motion is an act of will. Not reflex. Your fingers are so wax-coated you've stopped distinguishing between skin and resin. They're just tools now, pale and numb and oddly shiny. You pry the first candle loose with a soft twist and hold it up to the light. It's lopsided, of course it is, and the wick's too short and the base is bubbled, and you stare at it with the blank acceptance of someone being handed a divorce decree. They already expected, it's fine. It's fine. The church won't notice if they're burning it in the back row. You line it up with the others, a half-formed army of crooked soldiers, all slightly different shades of beige failure. And for a brief moment you wonder what it would be like to make something beautiful just once. Something smooth and clean and free of the smell of rotting cow grease and singed wool. But beauty isn't profitable, and you are above all a servant of necessity, not art. So you keep unmolding, sliding each candle out like a little bird. And by the time you finish, your apron looks like it survived the pig slaughter, and your arms are streaked with burns in the shape of iron rings, and you're too tired to notice the newest one until it starts to itch under the wax layer that coats your forearm. Like a medieval shellac, you scratch at it with the corner of a tool, not gently, more like chiseling barnacles off a boat. And you tell yourself that when you get home tonight, you'll soak in something hot, even if it's just boiled rainwater and regret. But you know you won't, because by the time you drag yourself up the ladder to your sleeping corner, you'll be too far gone. And the idea of removing your wax cake socks will feel about as possible as lifting a cathedral with your teeth, so instead, you light one of the newly cooled candles and place it on the shelf above the workbench. Not for light, but for company, because the flame flickers in a way that feels like a heartbeat, like someone else breathing with you in the room, and you find that comforting in a way that should probably worry you. And that's when you realize you've started talking to the candles. Not every day, not in full sentences, but little mutterings, little comments under your breath. Like you'll pass or you'll do better than I did, and you can't remember exactly when that started, but it feels natural now, like a superstition or a tick. And if someone walked in and saw you, you'd be embarrassed maybe, or maybe not. Maybe you just hand them a wick and ask them to dip something before they judge. And as you start trimming the bases and scraping off the overflow and smoothing the edges, your hands fall into their familiar rhythm again, and your brain detaches slightly, floating just above the moment, drifting somewhere between memory and delusion. And that's when the visions begin. Not visions exactly, but fragments, shadows, things in the corners of your eyes that you've learned not to chase the soft sound of whispering when no one's nearby. The flicker of movement in the melted wax, like it's reflecting something that isn't there, and the way the air bends just slightly when the fire flares too brightly, for no reason at all. You don't mention this to anyone, of course, because who would you tell the butcher? Who overcharges you for pig guts, the guild inspector, who already thinks you're too quiet? The boy who sweeps the floor and pretends not to hear you, muttering to the flames. No, this is your world, and you've made peace with the idea that you might be losing your grip, because honestly, what else is there to hold on to? And besides, madness isn't as frightening as people say. It's more like stepping into a different room where everything still exists, just in different shapes, and where candles hum softly when you're alone, and the smoke patterns spell out things you can't quite read but feel like warnings or apologies, and you wonder idly if the wax has soaked into your blood by now. If your insides are slowly solidifying, if one day you'll crack open and find your heart coated in beeswax, pale and smooth and perfectly preserved, a sacred relic of suffering and survival and stubborn flame. And just as you reach for the final mold, the one that always sticks, always resists, always makes you bleed, the door creaks behind you and you freeze because no one should be entering at this hour. Not unless it's another inspector or something worse. And you turn slowly, candle in hand, ready to throw it if needed. And there's no one there, of course. There isn't just the sound of your own breath and the gentle hiss of cooling wax, and for a moment you wonder if you imagine the sound. But then the candle in your hand flares up bright and sudden and sharp like a gasp, and then settles again, quiet, flickering patient, and you don't speak, you don't move, you just hold it and breathe with it and wait. And eventually the stillness returns and you go back to your bench and begin again. Because that's what you do, and if something is watching, if something is listening, if something in the wax has started paying attention, well, at least now you're not the only one losing your mind. There's a line in your mind you used to swear you'd never cross a threshold between hard work and full-blown madness. And today, standing in the middle of your shop with a handful of half-cured tapers and a vague sensation that your bones are vibrating, you realize that line is somewhere behind you now, lost in a haze of smoke and boiling fat and too many hours breathing air. That's more candle than oxygen. It's not a dramatic shift. There's no single moment where you scream or collapse or rip your apron in half. It's quieter than that, more subtle, like the way wax hardens, slow, certain, irreversible, and you feel it most in the way your body has changed. Not just the burns or the blisters or the inexplicable twitch in your left eyelid that's been going since last Thursday, but deeper in your skin, your smell, your everything. You're becoming wax, or maybe the wax is becoming you. But either way, the line is gone and you're still working, because that's the only thing you know how to do. The first delivery of the afternoon is due in less than an hour, and it's the kind of job that makes your stomach drop 50 tallow votives for a monastery with high standards and low patience. And the last time your shipment was late, they sent a novitiate to observe your methods, and he stood in the corner reciting psalms while you nearly set your pants on fire. So this time, you're determined to be early, or at least on time, which means prepping the votives, packing them carefully, and not passing out halfway through, easier said than done. When your lungs feel like smoked sausages and your vision goes blurry every time you bend down, you line up the votives in rows, inspecting each one, like a general reviewing exhausted troops. And they all look more or less acceptable. Some a little cracked, some leaning like drunks in a storm, but nothing that screams heresy or warrants another holy visit. You pack them in straw and wrap the crate with a rope that used to be part of your apprentice's belt before he quit and ran off to become a cooper, which frankly, you should have done too. Because no one ever loses their mind over barrels. But here you are, surrounded by warm wax and colder regrets, tying knots with a fraying rope and humming under your breath. And that's when you notice the smell again. Not the usual bouquet of grease and smoke and failure, but something sharper, sourer, a rotten edge that cuts through the heat like a knife. You pause, sniff, and follow it to the back wall, where the tallow barrels are stored. You open the lid of the newest one and recoil immediately, because whatever died in there wasn't a cow or a pig. Not anymore. Not by smell. It's evolved into something worse, something that gurgles faintly if you listen too closely, and you slam the lid shut and whisper an apology, not sure who it's for, the fat or yourself. And then you swear to use a different barrel, even if it costs you more coin and a little pride, because the last thing you need is a crate full of cursed votives, igniting a monastery mid-vespers, You choose a better batch, the one that only smells like unwashed feet and not actual decomposition, and get back to work, hands moving automatically, dipping and trimming and cooling and polishing like some sad, wax-covered machine. And every once in a while, you look down and realize you've been talking aloud. Just a running monologue of curses and reassurances and strange little stories. And sometimes you answer yourself, which is fine. Probably because no one's around to hear, or at least no one with a soul. You mutter something to a particularly stubby candle and it flickers in response, and you don't react because that's normal now. Just like how your sleeves stick to your arms, or how the floor creaks in patterns that sound like footsteps, even when you're alone. The votives are finally done, and the crate is sealed. And you sit down just for a second, just to breathe. But the second turns into a minute, and the minute turns into a strange fugue state, where you stare at your hands and wonder when they stopped being hands and started being tools. Your fingers are cracked, yellowed and speckled with burns. Your nails are dark with grime, and your palms feel like they've been dipped in glue, which they have repeatedly. You remember being proud of your hands, once strong, steady, skilled, but now they're just extensions of the job, blunt instruments for shaping light out of animal remnants and desperation. You flex them and wince and flex them again, and think this is the cost. This is what it takes to survive a life built on melting and molding and waiting for the flame to burn out. You blink, shake your head, and stand up too fast, which makes your knees pop and your spine twinge and your vision darken at the edges, but you don't fall. Not this time. You grab the crate and hobble toward the door, ready to deliver your madness in a box to the men who think candles are a symbol of divine illumination instead of what they really are, compressed suffering and slightly sweet smoke. You open the door and the light hits you like a slap, full and bright and invasive, and you squint and step forwards, crate in hand, back bent, and as you make your way through the alley toward the chapel gate, people look at you and you know what? They see a wax-dusted ghost with sunken eyes and a lurching gait, a creature of habit and heat and fumes. But you don't care. Not anymore. Not when there's work to be done and orders to fill, and a job that won't stop until you do, and even then probably not. And as you reach the steps and ring the bell for delivery, you whisper to the votives inside, soft and strange and automatic. Just a little benediction from one broken soul to another, because deep down you know they understand you better than anyone else ever could. The crate is gone now, dropped off at the monastery steps with a nod and a grunt, and a vague wave of thanks from a monk who barely looked you in the eye. And you didn't wait around for formalities because every second spent outdoors feels like borrowed time, like you've stepped out of your assigned punishment cell and the air itself is watching, waiting to drag you back. So you shuffled home with empty hands and a strange tightness in your chest that could be pride or heartburn or both. And by the time you reach your shop again, the skies turn that ugly medieval grey. Not quite storm, not quite peace. Just the permanent overcast of a world where the sun isn't so much absent as uninterested. You step through the warped doorway, greeted instantly by the familiar cloud of heat and musk and old wax. And it's like coming home to a punch in the face made of smells. Your shoulders sag in the way they always do when you realize you're still here, still responsible, still locked in this slow cooked descent into something between craftsman and cursed object. and you move through the workshop with the casual limp of someone who's forgotten what walking normally ever felt like. Your knees clicking, your ankle humming with that sharp nerve reminder that you twisted it last winter. Slipping on a puddle of cooling lard and never really recovered. But you've learned to ignore pain in the same way you ignore hunger, loneliness, or the occasional high-pitched ringing in your ears that might be tinnitus or divine judgment, or just the sound of your brain leaking. You sit down on your stool and exhale so deeply, it feels like you're deflating your apron stiff with old wax creaks as you adjust it, and you realize you've been wearing it for 3 days straight because it's easier than cleaning it. And besides, it now functions like armor, a crusty protective shell that smells like beef, candle and human despair. You glance at the workbench and see what's waiting for you next. A fresh order from a noble family for a set of pure beeswax, devotional tapers, which means 3 things. You'll have to touch the expensive wax, you'll have to handle it with care, and you'll hate every second of it, because beeswax, while cleaner than tallow, is more temperamental, more smug, more prone to cracking. If the temperature's off, or the humidity shifts, or you so much as look at it the wrong way, and the family crest, they want carved into each one. Laughable, intricate, and designed by someone who clearly has never worked with a carving tool and a semi-melted stick of golden wax. But you don't get to complain, not unless you want to end up fined by the guild or replaced by someone who still has all 10 fingers. So you haul out the precious yellow bricks of beeswax like they're relics, setting them on the bench with all the reverence you can muster, which at this point is somewhere between begrudging grunt and eye twitch. And you begin the melting process slowly, gently, monitoring the pot with a kind of focus normally reserved for surgery or bomb defusal, because 1 degree too high and it scorches 1 second too long and the fragrance is ruined. And these people aren't just buying candles, they're buying status ritual, a sense of superiority. They can light at dinner and pretend makes them holier than the rest of us. You stir with the long-handled spoon, the one you've used since before the plague took your neighbor's boy and left your street with 1 less mouth to scream. And as the beeswax melts, it releases a scent that's so sweet, so clean, so out of place in this den of grease and grime, that you almost resent it, like it's mocking you with its golden glow and gentle perfume. And as it liquefies, you catch your reflection in the copper pot, warped and shimmering, your face rippling like a ghost in a puddle. And for a moment you don't recognize the person staring back, not because you've forgotten what you look like, but because you've changed subtly, steadily. Your skin paler, your eyes more hollow, your lips permanently cracked. You look like someone who lives too close to heat and too far from hope. And the worst part is you don't feel horror or grief, or even surprise. You feel familiar, like this is just who you are now. This is what happens when you spend every day in a room where things melt, where things bend, where nothing ever stays whole for long. You pour the wax into the molds thinner, taller, more delicate than your usual fare. And as it fills each cavity, you realize your hands are shaking, not from fear or fatigue, but from the sheer pressure of perfection. Because if even one of these is off-center or uneven or cracked, they'll send them back with a note penned in calligraphy that might as well say you're a failure in gold ink, and the guild will nod along and dock your pay, and someone somewhere will say, it's just a candle while you bleed from your palms and pretend it's wax. The tapers cool slowly, and while you wait, you begin carving the first crest, a lion devouring a stag, because of course nobility always wants something violent and majestic. You drag the blade across the wax with surgical precision, each curve, and flourish a gamble against your trembling joints. And as you work, you hear the whispers again, faint at first, then louder, echoing off the beams above you, like someone dropped a voice into your head and let it roll around loose. You stop carving, listen, and for a moment you swear the flame from the beeswax candle you lit earlier pulses in time with the voice, and it says something like melt or remember or return. But when you blink, the flame is normal again, and the whisper is gone, replaced by the creak of the floorboards settling and the distant bark of a dog who somehow always knows when you're close to unraveling. You finish the crest, set the taper aside, and start the next one without comment, without thought, because the work must go on, because you're not here to interpret hallucinations or decode the secret language of fire. You're here to survive one candle at a time, and if the wax wants to talk, it can wait until tomorrow. The room is quiet now, not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the heavy kind, the kind that hums behind your ears and settles in your teeth, the kind that only exists after the noise dies down and you realize you've been working too long without stopping, without thinking, without blinking, and your body has reached that familiar state of half-numb limbo. Every part of you too tired to hurt properly, but still aching somewhere deep behind the joints like a protest. No one's listening to anymore. The devotional tapers are done, laid out in a neat little row that mocks you with their symmetry, gold and pristine and unbearably smug, and you stare at them with the dull satisfaction of someone who's finished digging their own grave and wants a minute to admire the craftsmanship. But there's no rest. Not in this line of work. Not in this kind of life. Because you still have the floor to scrub and the soot to scrape and the tools to clean and the apprentice to yell at for not showing up again. Even though you're pretty sure he quit 2 days ago and just hasn't said anything. But that's fine. That's his problem. Yours is this building, this shop, this body that creaks and bends like old wood and smells like an overcooked dinner that's been left under a floorboard. You move to clean the molds first, because if you leave them too long, the wax hardens inside and you'll have to chisel it out, like you're extracting secrets from a tomb, and the last time you let that happen, you lost half a thumbnail and most of your patience. So you get to work, fingers cramping around a rusted pick you've used so long. The handle has shaped itself to your grip, and the motions are automatic now, like breathing or muttering under your breath. You scrape, wipe, rinse, dry, repeat, and all the while the candlelight flickers behind you, casting long, thin shadows across the workshop walls that sometimes move in ways they shouldn't, sometimes stretch when you're standing still, sometimes ripple like water when there's no wind, but you don't pay attention anymore. Not really, because if you noticed every strange thing that happened in this place, you'd never get anything done. And besides, you've long accepted that some of the things in your periphery are real, and some are just your brain trying to keep itself entertained before it melts. You've even named a few of the shadows. The tall one by the stair is Gregory. The wide one by the fire is Marta, and the one that lingers near the back door and never quite leaves is simply called It. You don't talk to them, not out loud, but sometimes you nod when they move and you think they appreciate it. Even shadows like to be acknowledged. The scraping finishes with a final clatter of metal against stone, and you stretch wincing as your shoulders pop like gravel underfoot, and you look down at your hands red and raw and wax glazed, and you wonder briefly how much of you is still skin, and how much is just build up layers upon layers of hardened fat and smoke and failure. You could probably light yourself on fire and burn for 8 hours, maybe more, if you skipped breakfast, and the thought makes you laugh. Not because it's funny, but because it's plausible. And that's where you are now, laughing at your own combustibility, while surrounded by flickering lights and the smell of old meat. You wander over to the back room to check the storage barrels, just to keep busy, just to feel like you're maintaining some kind of control over the chaos. And you find one of the lids askew, not off, just tilted slightly, like someone or something peeked in and left in a hurry, and your heart skips, not in fear exactly, but in a kind of tired irritation, like when a child unravels all the thread you spent an hour winding. You ease the lid off and peer inside, and you're immediately hit with a smell that's somehow worse than the earlier rot. A deep, earthy, crawling scent that makes you think of graves and wet fur and the inside of a butcher's waste barrel. But there's nothing in there. Nothing visible anyway. Just fat and wax and the faint suggestion of movement. That could have been your imagination or a trick of the light, or the way your pulse throbbed too hard in your temples. You close the barrel slowly, press down hard on the lid and whisper, stay not to anything in particular, not out of superstition or faith, but because it feels like the right thing to say, like a boundary you have to draw, even if you know it won't hold you. Return to the workshop and sit again this time, letting the weight of the day press down on you like a thick hot blanket. Your clothes stick to your skin, your back is damp, your hair is matted to your scalp, and your eyelids feel like they've been sanded down with ash and grit. But still, you don't sleep. You don't even rest. You just sit there and watch the candles burn, all of them, every shape and size and color flickering together in a strange rhythm that almost feels choreographed, like a silent chorus of fire, whispering secrets in a language you used to speak before your mind started leaking out through your pores. And you think, not for the first time, that maybe there's something alive in the wax, not metaphorically, not poetically, but actually alive, something that sees you, knows you, maybe even listens when you mutter in the dark and you wonder what it wants, what it remembers if it dreams, when the flames die out. And if it dreams, does it dream of you, hunched and coughing and covered in burns, feeding it with your hands, day after day like some forgotten priest, to a sticky, glistening god? And just as you feel yourself slipping into that familiar mental spiral, the one that always ends with you staring at your own reflection in a puddle of wax and asking it unanswerable questions, you shake yourself, blink, stand, stretch again, and tell yourself, it's just exhaustion, just fumes, just you being dramatic, and tomorrow will be better. It won't be. But telling yourself it will is a ritual now, and rituals have power. At least that's what the monks say, and for once you agree with them. Because after everything, after all the heat and stink and shadows, you light one last candle, place it on the shelf above your bedroll and whisper good night to the flame. And for just a second you swear it nods. You don't remember falling asleep, only that you woke up with your cheek stuck to the floor and a mouth full of candle dust, the kind that grits between your teeth like bone powder and clings to your tongue long after you spit, and your entire body aches in that deep old way. Like the ache isn't from a single cause, but the accumulation of everything. Heat smoke, labor time, and as you sit up slowly, vertebrae snapping like dry twigs, you glance around the room and briefly wonder if you died sometime in the night. And this is the afterlife, dim and quiet and wax-scented. But no, it's still your workshop, still the same greasy tomb you crawl through day after day. And judging by the light slinking through the soot-smeared window, it's not quite dawn, which means you accidentally got a few hours of sleep and should be grateful though. Grateful isn't an emotion. You remember how to feel your body feels. Like a used candle stub burnt down, soggy at the base, a little misshapen, and as you stagger to your feet, your hip cracks so loud it startles one of the rats nesting behind the mold shelf. It darts across the floor and disappears under the crates, and you nod at it like an old friend. Not even annoyed, just acknowledging its hustle because the rats work as hard as you do and probably smell better. You shuffle toward the water bucket and splash your face with what might generously be called liquid, but more accurately resembles lukewarm grime, with occasional floating surprises, and it doesn't refresh you so much as wake up the parts of your face that were beginning to go numb. Then it's time to change. Not into something clean. Nothing in your wardrobe has been clean since last fall, but at least something less soaked. You peel off your work shirt like shedding a waxy cocoon, and the new one, stiff with dried fat darkened with smoke, clings to your damp skin with all the affection of a wet shroud. You fasten the leather apron over it and tighten the strap which tugs on the bruise blooming across your ribs from where you tripped over a mold rack yesterday, and you breathe through the pain because what else can you do? There's no healer in town who deals in bruises unless they're royal, and you're about as far from royalty as a man can get without turning into a mole. Your hands move through the motions automatically, now gathering the tools, checking the barrels, setting out the mold frames, and all the while you're aware, uncomfortably aware, of the fact that no matter what you do, no matter how early you start or how efficiently you work, it's never enough. There's always more orders, always more soot, always more wax, to melt as if the world itself runs on a supply of human suffering, and you're just one more cog cranking it out in greasy, flickering batches. You step outside for a moment, just to clear your lungs before the real work begins, but the street greets you with the usual blend of rot and smoke and horse, and the passing woman makes a face and pulls her child closer when she sees you, as if candle stink is contagious, or your misery might leap onto her baby's nice linen bonnet. And you don't blame her. Not really. Because you do look like something that crawled out of a furnace. Soot-streaked, wax-caked eyes, ringed in sleepless purple. So you step back inside where you belong, where no one expects you to smile or nod or pretend you're still fully human. And you get to work because today's not just another day of dipping tapers or pouring molds. Today is noble order. Day again. Another family with more titles than teeth has decided they want ceremonial candles for a feast or a funeral or both. It's always both. And they've sent a messenger with a list so precise it makes your teeth hurt. The candles must be made with beeswax only from the northern apiary. The wicks must be dyed with elderberry extract to give them a slight purple hue, and each one must be exactly 14 inches long. No exceptions, and you know full well that these demands were written by someone who has never once poured wax, never once burned their fingers on a mold ring, never once spent an afternoon scraping congealed lard off their shoe with a spoon. But it doesn't matter because they're paying, and coin is coin. Even if it's covered in arrogance, you set to work, measuring and cutting and stirring and sighing. and by mid-morning, the shop is once again its own little hellscape of steam and fire and buzzing flies who seem to live forever. No matter how often you swat them, the northern beeswax has a different scent, lighter, sweeter, but also more temperamental, like it knows it's expensive and resents being melted, and you talk to it under your breath, coaxing it into the pot, reminding it gently that resistance only makes things worse, and the wax bubbles back at you like it's considering your offer. And you smile, not because it's funny, but because the idea of arguing with wax is somehow less absurd than anything else about your day. And as the candles begin to take shape, you realize your hands are shaking again. A slight tremble that you chalk up to fatigue or hunger or fumes until you look closer and see the red blooming under your skin. Thin red threads running across your knuckles and up your wrists like veins made of fire. And you pause mid-motion watching them pulse. Not in pain exactly, just in warning. Like a candle flickering before it dies out. And you flex your fingers, clench and unclench, and tell yourself it's nothing. It's fine, you're fine. And maybe if you say it enough, the wax will believe it too. So you keep working, keep pouring, keep shaping. Because that's all there is really. And when the sun begins to set behind the rooftops and the light dims into that smoky blue dusk, you don't stop, because stopping feels worse than pain, worse than sweat, worse than knowing you'll have to do it all again tomorrow. And as you place the last noble taper in its carved wooden box, sealing it like a coffin, you glance at the candles on your shelf. The rejects, the bent ones, the ones with too much wick or too little soul, and they flicker at you in a way that feels almost approving. And you nod back, because in this place respect from the imperfect means more than praise from the elite. You haven't eaten today, not really just gnawed the edge off a hunk of hard bread that could double as a paving stone, and licked the rim of a jar that used to hold pickled onions, and your stomach has long since stopped growling and started sulking in silence, curling inward like a bitter animal waiting for someone to apologize. But there's no time for food, no time for anything that isn't wax or wicks or regret, because the noble order is boxed and sealed. But now the local baker's widow has sent her boy with a breathless request for 12 prayer candles by nightfall. And you can't say no to her, not because she pays well, she doesn't, but because she brings the leftover crusts and the broken pies. And sometimes she smiles at you, like she doesn't see a ghost in an apron. And that's rare enough to count as a miracle. So you drag yourself back to the melting pot and throw in what's left of the last usable tallow, scraping the bottom of the barrel with a clang that echoes like a warning bell, and you tell yourself it'll be enough. It has to be, because you're not about to spend your night boiling down the mystery grease you were saving for emergencies, the kind that smells like old sins and attracts cats that won't leave the tallow sizzles and pops as it melts, bubbling in a way that feels vaguely hostile, like it knows you're asking too much from too little. But you stir it anyway, whispering small apologies, soft reassurances, not because it makes a difference, but because the silence in this room has started to take on a shape, and you're not ready to see what it becomes if you let it grow. The prayer candles aren't fancy. No carvings, no gilded bases, just plain, clean, burning stubs meant to flicker behind weeping eyes and clutched rosaries. But even so, you treat them carefully like they matter, because they do. Because even if the world outside sees you as a soot-covered nuisance, these candles go into hands that are hurting, grieving, pleading, and you started to think maybe that means something. Maybe all the pain you pour into them becomes warmth for someone else, and you're not sure if that's beautiful or pathetic, but you lean into it anyway, because you need something to believe in before the fumes scrape out. The last of your thoughts, your fingers tremble as you dip and roll and trim the familiar rhythm of your labor like a lullaby. You hum through the shakes, and somewhere in the back of your mind, a new kind of pain begins to bloom. Not the sharp, useful kind that says you've been burned, but the deeper, more treacherous kind that says something inside you is breaking, and you won't know what until it's too late. But there's no time for that. There's only the next candle and the next and the next, until you look up and realize the sun is almost gone, and the workshop is dimming into that strange twilight zone where everything feels thinner, like the walls can breathe and the shadows have ears. So you light one of the finished prayer candles and place it on the bench beside you. Its glow soft and uneven, a small flame trying to do too much, and you envy it, you really do. Because even as it burns itself out, it still gets to shine. The boy comes back just as you're wrapping the last stub in cloth, his face flushed from running, his hands shaking as he takes the bundle, and thanks you with the kind of sincere relief you haven't felt in years. And you watch him run back down the alley with the candles clutched to his chest like a treasure. And for a brief, impossible second, you feel useful, like you're part of something better than this decaying world of soot and sweat and silent suffering. But then the wind shifts, and the strange smell rolls in smoky. Yes, but wrong. Thick and bitter and sour in a way that curls your lip and makes the hairs on your arms stand up. And you step outside to find the source, and you see it down the lane just beyond the baker's place. A column of dark smoke rising like a black tree into the purple sky, and your heart drops, because you know that smoke, you've smelled that fire. It's a grease fire, a fat fire, and there's only one reason for that smell to be drifting your way. Someone's melting their own candles, someone's trying to steal your trade, and maybe that shouldn't feel like betrayal. Maybe you should be glad someone else is taking on the burden, but instead, it feels like a knife to the chest. Because this was your madness, your ritual, your hell to endure alone. And now someone else is trying it on like a costume playing candlemaker for a day. Like it's something quaint and profitable, and you want to scream, want to run down the street and show them your hands, show them the scars and burns and calluses, scream. That it's not a game, that it ruins you, that you can't sleep anymore without hearing the drip of wax or the hiss of smoke in your dreams. But you don't, because even in your fury, your pettiness, your exhaustion, you understand that maybe they're just desperate too. Maybe they're lighting their own fire because they've run out of other options. And maybe the world doesn't need just one mad candlemaker losing his mind in a greasy shrine to forgotten saints. Maybe it needs more people willing to burn. So you step back inside, close the door against the smoke and the anger and the noise of other people living their lives differently than you. And you sit back down, light another candle, and whisper nothing at all, because there's nothing left to say that hasn't already melted into the air. And for now, silence is the only thing that hasn't burned you yet. The smoke's still hanging in the air like a bad memory. By the time you finish wiping down your workbench with a rag that used to be white, but now functions more like a grease sponge, that's just learned to lie about being clean. And even though the fire from earlier is dying down, somewhere down the lane, the scent lingers, burnt lard and scorched wood, and something faintly acidic that no one ever admits is bone. And you try to shake it off, try to focus on the tasks in front of you, because there's always something, always wax, to reheat or molds to scrub or wicks to untangle. Like it's some divine test of patience handed down by a god who clearly doesn't like you very much. And right now, the job is fixing the batch from yesterday, the ones that bent in the night like flowers wilting under a heavy sky, some of them slumped, others cracked, all of them useless, unless you reheat and reshape and pray. They set straight this time, and as you lean over the flame to begin the slow, stupid process of softening the warped sticks of failure, you feel the heat roll over your face like a second skin, not burning, exactly just pushing a kind of weight that settles on your shoulders and reminds you that even your air comes with a cost. You press your thumb against the base of one candle, slowly twisting it upright, while the wax melts just enough to comply, and for a moment it holds, it works. The candle stands straight in your hand like a soldier called back from collapse, but then the wick slips and you watch it fall back into a lean, lazy and crooked, like it knows you're too tired to try again. And instead of fixing it, you place it aside, a quiet surrender, a whispered agreement between you and the wax, that sometimes things just aren't worth the fight. Outside the sky turns darker, a heavy blue that always comes just before the true nightfall, and you move to light your corner lamps, each one a patchwork of tin and glass, held together by stubbornness and the occasional prayer. And as the flames rise inside them, the room changes less, a workshop now, more a cave, a shrine, a flickering theatre where every object has a shadow, and every shadow might be watching you lean back against the wall and breathe in the heavy smell of burnt wick and beeswax and sweat-soaked linen, and your legs are buzzing again. Not pain exactly, just that numbness that crawls up when you've been standing too long, and your blood has decided to protest by taking a smoke break, and you think about sitting, maybe just for a second, just to let your knees stop shaking. But the floor is sticky from a spill you forgot to clean earlier, and the stool is splintered, and your body has reached that strange medieval equilibrium where standing hurts less than sitting and moving, hurts less than staying still. So you stay upright, swaying slightly, eyes half-lidded and watching the flame in the lamp nearest your face, the way it bends and dances and jumps when the air shifts, and you start to think of it not as light, but as a creature, something alive, something small and bright and feral. And you realize how many hours you've spent staring at flames like this, how many days you've ended just like this, staring, until the shapes start to change, until the flicker becomes a face or a hand or a thing with eyes. And you don't flinch anymore. When that happens, you just nod, like it's an old friend that drops by to check. You're still breathing, still sweating, still here. And you wonder if that's what it wants, if that's what any of this wants. Not perfection or faith or beauty, just presence, just your continued stubborn presence in a world that keeps trying to melt you down. You walk over to the shelf where the failed candles are stacked, bent and blistered and blackened, and you run your fingers over them like they're artifacts from another life. Like maybe you used to be someone who made things that stood tall and straight and flawless. But now all you make are offerings, crooked, broken little offerings to a life that never wanted anything more from you than your hands and your time and your willingness to sweat in silence. You take one of the rejects and light it anyway, setting it down on the floor near the door, where the draft will make it sputter, and you watch it flicker, unstable and weak, but still burning, still trying. And it feels honest, more honest than the perfect ones in the window that never get used, just admired and sold and forgotten. And you think maybe that's the point. Maybe all of this, the labor, the pain, the repetition, isn't about beauty or light or legacy. Maybe it's about endurance, about the fact that you kept burning when you had every reason to go out. And just as you settle into that thought, just as you find a strange kind of peace in the idea that your work means something, even if no one ever sees it, there's a sound sharp and sudden from behind the wall near the storage room. A kind of knock, but not a knock. Exactly more like a thud, a soft punch of something solid against something older, and your breath catches in your throat because no one should be back there. Not at this hour, not ever really. And you listen, frozen, heart thudding loud enough to drown the silence. And there it is again, louder now, closer, and something in you goes cold. A deep animal cold that comes from a place beneath language, and your hand moves on its own to the hot iron ladle resting by the stove, because that's the closest thing to a weapon you have, and something inside you knows you'll need it. But when you step toward the door, it stops. The sound disappears, like it was never there. Like the silence swallowed it whole, and the only thing left is the low hum of your own fear, and the tiny candle on the floor still burning in the draft, wobbling but alive, and you stay there in the doorway for a long moment, listening to the quiet and staring at the flicker, and you tell yourself, it was nothing, the building settling a rat, a bad dream slipping through into the real world. But you keep the ladle in your hand anyway, as you close the door and return to your bench. And for the rest of the night, the shadows seem just a little longer than they used to be. You start the morning later than you should, and earlier than you want, which means you're already in a losing race with the day, before your eyes even finish crusting open. And the first thing you notice isn't the light or the sound, or even the fact that you've fallen asleep face down on a board covered in wax shavings. Again, it's the smell, burnt, sour, metallic, like someone lit fire to a butcher's apron, and then tried to bless it with vinegar, and you sit up too fast, and your back immediately protests with the kind of sharp, sudden agony that makes you reconsider everything you've ever stood for. But there's no time to stretch or groan or even think, because the smell is wrong even by your standards. And when your life is a 24-hour parade of heated animal fat and scorched rope, anything that registers as worse than usual is worth paying attention to. You stagger across the workshop, feet sticking slightly to the floor in patches where wax has puddled and cooled like tiny traps laid by your past self, and you reach the back shelf where you keep the raw materials and cursed surprises, and there it is, the culprit, a bucket of leftover sheep tallow that's gone so rancid the lid is puffed up like it's breathing, and when you pry it open with the tip of your knife, the stench that hits you is so immediate, so thick and hostile, it feels like a physical slap to the throat. Your eyes water, your stomach clenches, and you slam the lid back down with a gasp, muttering something between a prayer and a threat, because whatever was inside that bucket was not just spoiled. It was actively plotting your downfall. You drag it outside to the alley, hurl it behind the pile of broken molds and leave it there like an offering to whatever hungry gods patrol the streets at dawn. Then you go back inside. Light 3 candles just to feel normal again, and try to reset your brain, which is already humming with too many thoughts and not enough boundaries, because today is tax day. Not for you, at least not officially, but for the guild. And that means someone will be coming by to inspect your inventory, which is medieval code for count your candles. and make vague threats while stealing your good wax, and you've been through this before. You know how it goes. The man arrives in a cloak, 2 sizes too large, with fingers that never stop twitching, and eyes that don't quite blink, and he sniffs around like he's trying to find evidence of crime in your dust. And even though you've done nothing wrong, unless staying alive while poor counts you still sweat through your shirt, every time he picks up a candle and hums at it like he's talking to a ghost. So you spend the next hour rearranging your shelves to look more impressive and less depressing, stacking your best pieces up front and hiding the lopsided ones in a crate marked personal use. And you're halfway through wiping down the counter when he appears. No knock, no greeting. Just the quiet creak of the door, and then the overwhelming presence of someone who has never made anything in his life but holds the power to ruin yours anyway. You nod to him, not out of respect, but out of habit. And he starts walking the room in slow, dragging circles, making soft little noises like a man tasting soup, and finding it suspicious. And you stand there with your hands behind your back and your jaw clenched, trying not to look like someone who once swore they'd punch a guild inspector in the mouth, which you did technically, though it was years ago, and you're fairly certain this one hasn't heard that story. Or maybe he has, and that's why he keeps glancing at your hands like they're loaded. He picks up a taper, sniffs it, frowns, then moves on to a ceremonial pillar that took you 3 full days to pour and shape and trim, and he turns it over like it's nothing. Like your time and labor and lower back spasms don't register as real effort. And when he finally speaks, it's in that same nasal tone they all use, like every word is a legal document, and you should be grateful to hear it. He says, your weights are slightly off, your labels are unclear, and your inventory count is suspiciously high. For a man who looks this tired, and you nod again, still not speaking, because if you open your mouth right now, the words that come out will not be appropriate for someone with the authority to fine you into starvation. He finishes his circuit, scribbles something onto a scrap of parchment, and hands it to you with a flourish, like he's bestowing knighthood, and you read the note and see the fine, not ruinous. Just enough to sting, just enough to remind you where you stand in the grand order of things. And as he leaves, you stare at the number and try to decide what hurts more, the money or the sheer indignity of it. The way these men come into your space, touch your work, judge your life, and walk away without a second thought. You crumple the parchment and toss it into the stove. Watch it curl and blacken and vanish in the flames. And for a brief moment, you wonder what it would feel like to follow it. Not in a dramatic way, not in a tragic way, just out of curiosity, out of fatigue. But then the candle nearest your elbow sputters and spits a tiny fleck of wax onto your hand, and the pain is sharp and sudden and grounding. And you realize you still have too much to do, too many obligations, too many orders, too many strange dreams of waxy faces whispering to you in your sleep. To give up now, so you take a breath, wipe your eyes, and go back to the molds, because the work never stops, and neither do you. And if the world insists on pressing its boot against your back, then fine, you'll just learn how to breathe under it. The fine sits somewhere in the back of your mind like a splinter. You can't reach, not sharp enough to make you bleed, but irritating enough to ruin every thought that comes after it. And as the day staggers forward, dragging your body along like a half-dead ox, strapped to a wheelbarrow of burning chores, you try to focus on the simple stuff, the small tasks, the things that usually soothe you. Cutting wicks, straightening molds, sorting finished candles into crates according to size and type, and likelihood of being judged by a self-important priest. But nothing feels simple today. Your hands are clumsy, your shoulders ache in a way that makes you question the basic mechanics of being upright. And every time you pass the shelf where you keep the good wax, the beeswax, reserved for high-paying clients and ceremonial orders, you feel a flicker of something inside you that's hard to name but easy to hate. Maybe it's bitterness, maybe it's hunger, maybe it's just the last thin thread of dignity trying not to snap, because you know you should save that wax. You know, it's your only real asset. But you're so tired of the smell of cheap tallow and the sting of half-cured grease in your eyes. So you reach for a brick of beeswax and you melt it down just a little, just enough for a candle or two. And you tell yourself it's fine that you've earned this, that lighting a clean, sweet candle in your own miserable shop shouldn't feel like a luxury, reserved for people with titles and servants and livers that still function properly. The wax melts slow and rich and gold, and the scent hits you like a memory. You didn't know you had something warm and distant, a farmhouse maybe, or a dream of summer, before your bones turned brittle and your clothes became a second skin of filth, and you pour the wax into a mold meant for chapel tapers. But today, it's just for you, just something to hold on to. And when it sets, you trim the wick and light it, and place it on the corner of the workbench, where the shadows gather deepest, and you watch it burn for a long time longer than you should. The flame clean and tall and impossibly steady in this drafty, splinter-ridden dungeon you call a workshop, and it's not a solution. It doesn't pay the fine or fix your back or remove the smell of disappointment from your shirt, but it does something else, something quieter. It reminds you that you're still here, still capable of making something beautiful, even if no one else sees it, even if the light is wasted on wood, rot, and cobwebs. And maybe that's enough, maybe that's all this job is, burning yourself down. One flicker at a time, just to prove you haven't gone out yet. You sit beside it as you work carving molds and prepping bases and setting out another batch of wick bundles to dry, and you talk to the flame like you used to talk to your brother before he left for the coast and forgot to send word. Or maybe he did, and the letter got soaked or lost or intercepted by a crow. With a grudge, who knows anymore? The candle doesn't respond. Of course it doesn't, but it listens, and that's more than you can say for most people in this town. And after a while, you stop talking and just work in silence, letting the heat and the glow and the quiet fill the space in your head where anxiety usually builds nests. But eventually even that candle burns low, the beeswax dipping into a shallow pool at the base, the flame shrinking into a whisper, and you sigh, because everything good ends too quickly, and everything awful drags on, like it's got nowhere better to be, and you blow out the candle and brace yourself for the return of the usual gloom. But instead, you hear a knock at the door, not a sharp one, not guild sharp or landlord sharp, but softer, hesitant. And you hesitate too, because people don't knock on your door unless something's wrong, unless someone's died or broken something or needs something they can't afford to pay for. And when you finally open it, there's a girl standing there, no more than 12, clutching a bundle wrapped in oilcloth and blinking up at you like she's not entirely convinced you're real. And she says her mother's gone to the church and her father's down with the fever, and her baby brother won't stop crying when the lights go out and she doesn't have money. But she has this, and she hands you the bundle, and inside is half a loaf of bread and a turnip, and what might be a chunk of cheese if you look at it in the right light. And she asks shyly if you have a candle. Just one, not big, Doesn't even have to be new. Just something to make the shadows leave his crib for a little while. And you stand there holding this food like it's a crown and staring at her like you've forgotten how people work. Because it's been so long since someone offered you anything without expectation. So long since someone asked without a tone or a bribe or a complaint. And you nod and step aside and let her in while you gather the supplies, and you don't give her a reject or a leftover or a stub. You give her one of the chapel tapers, one of the clean, tall, perfect ones. And when she protests, you hush her and say it's for the boy, not her. And the gods would be furious if she tried to downgrade a child's first nightlight. And she smiles, and you hand her the candle, and she hands you the bundle, and the door closes behind her. And for a moment, you don't feel alone, not completely. And you sit back down at your bench and unwrap the bread and the cheese, and you eat not quickly, not like someone starving, but slowly like someone remembering how food works. And you light another beeswax candle, not for work, not for orders, but just because you can. And you lean back in your chair and let it burn while the wax drips quietly and the shadows retreat. Not because they're scared, but because tonight for once, they know they're not needed. You stay in your chair longer than you mean to the bread gone, the cheese reduced to a salty memory stuck between your teeth, and the candle on the bench flickering in lazy arcs, like it knows you're watching but doesn't care to perform. And it's strange how full you feel, not just from food, which was real and solid and didn't crunch like grit for once, but from something harder to define, a heaviness that isn't sadness, a warmth that isn't comfort. Maybe it's gratitude, maybe it's the ghost of it, something half-formed and long neglected stretching out inside your chest, like an animal that's just remembered how to uncurl. And you should go back to work. There's always more work, more orders, more wax, more grime. But for a few rare minutes the urgency has receded like a tide, and you let yourself be still breathing in air that smells faintly of beeswax and bread crust and not despair. And it's a luxury, this pause, this moment that feels human. But it's also fragile, already unraveling as the wind outside picks up and howls down the alley. Like it's looking for someone to blame. And you remember the gutters are clogged again. And the drip from the roof is probably turning the back wall into a fungus buffet. And there's a rat in the corner. You've started recognizing by the limp in its left hind leg, and it's chewing something. It didn't ask permission to chew, so you force yourself up, stretch with a wince and go, shoo it off. Not with anger, but with weary camaraderie. Because it's just doing what it knows, same as you, surviving rarely, messily, stubbornly. You sweep the crumbs into a pile with the heel of your boot, take the wax stubs from the floor and toss them into the melting pot to be reincarnated, and you start preparing for the next job, another funeral order. 3 dozen morning candles to be delivered by sunrise to the undertaker 2 streets over. And you don't know the name of the deceased, don't need to, doesn't matter. Because grief is one of the few things that keeps this trade going. The dead don't care about candle quality, but the living do the living, want something to light, something to watch, burn down, as if the slow, steady drip of wax can explain or erase the thing that's missing now. And so you melt and pour and trim and mold each candle shaped like a sigh. And you think about all the flames you've made, all the hours spent hunched over the heat, and how none of them ever lasted. They flickered, they danced, they burned, and then they died, and you made more again and again. Not for glory, not for art, but because that's what's needed. And sometimes you wonder if people are like that too. If you're like that burning just long enough for someone else to feel less alone. And the thought isn't tragic. Not today. Not with that girl's smile, still echoing faintly at the edge of your memory. It's just true. And you keep working into the evening, your hands moving even when your eyes blur. Muscle memory doing the lifting while your thoughts wander sideways. And it's not until the third candle in the last batch that something goes wrong. The wax hisses louder than it should. A sharp spitting noise that snaps you out of your trance, and you look down and see a hairline crack spreading across the mold, a thin silver line slicing through the center, like the mold is about to burst open and scream. And for a second, your stomach drops, because you know what comes next. You've seen it before, and sure enough, the crack widens with a sick pop, and the mold splits hot wax, gushing out like a wound, and you scramble backward, hands up, but too slow, too late, and the wax splashes onto your wrist, searing through your skin like molten spite, and you grunt sharp and low. No time to scream, just moving, always moving, grabbing a rag that's somehow never where you thought it was, pressing it to your wrist, while your teeth grind and your vision blurs, and you bite down a curse that tastes like copper and regret, and you sit back against the wall, cradling your hand, feeling the burn bloom and throb like a second heartbeat. And it's not the worst you've had, not by a long shot, but it's fresh and ugly and deep enough to make you question everything again. Because this is the part no one sees, the scars layered over scars, the way your body has become a map of all the times you stayed too long, pushed too hard, gave too much, and you press harder on the rag, breathing slow, trying to focus on anything else, and your eyes land on the broken mold split in half like a cracked rib, and it hits you that this mold's been with you for years. One of your first, old and battered and warped from 1,000 burns. And now it's done, not worth saving, not anymore. And you feel a strange sadness, ridiculous maybe, but real, because it was yours, and it lasted, and now it's not coming back. You pick up the pieces and set them aside gently, like they deserve that at least. And once your hand stops shaking, you go back to the bench and finish the batch slower now, more careful. And when the last candle sets and the molds are cooling and the smoke has thinned into faint ghosts drifting toward the rafters, you light one of the morning candles, not for the client, but for yourself, for the mold, for all the pieces of you that you've worn out and thrown away. And you sit beside it with your injured hand in your lap and your good one steadying the flame. And you watch it burn for a long time, not thinking, not planning, just being, just holding the space, just remembering that light. No matter how small, is still light. And maybe that's enough to get you through another night. You sleep in a little longer this morning because your wrist won't move right, and the muscles in your back feel like they've been knotted by a vengeful puppeteer. And when you finally drag yourself up from the thin wool mat that thinks it's a bed, the first thing you notice is how cold it's gotten. Not the kind of crisp, refreshing cold they write about in poems, but the damp, creeping kind that gets in under your fingernails and behind your eyes and makes your bones feel like soggy wood. The air in the workshop has teeth this morning, sharp little ones that nip at your ankles and bite your neck every time you turn your head too fast. And there's frost on the inside of the window panes again, curling in delicate patterns that would be beautiful if they weren't reminding you that the first thing you'll feel today is the slap of winter through a cracked roof and a missing glove, and you're still in your shirt from yesterday, still stiff with wax and smoke, and that faint, sweet tang of blood, where your skin split near the burn, and for a moment you just sit there on the edge of your sleeping mat staring at the same floorboard that's been loose for 3 years, and you think about how easy it would be to just keep sitting, to let the day pass you like a cart you forgot to jump onto. But the cold says otherwise. The cold makes decisions for you. So you get up creaking all the way and shuffle toward the firebox to light a flame that barely flickers on the first try, because the wood is damp and your fingers are too stiff to strike the flint right. But eventually it catches and you feed it scraps of wax and twisted cloth until the smoke starts to rise properly and the shadows begin to stretch and yawn, like they're just waking up too. You stoke the fire and warm your hands, grimacing when the heat hits your wrist, because the skin there is still raw and angry. A reminder from yesterday that your job is not without cost, and you wrap it in a strip of clean linen well cleanish because you know you can't afford to let it slow you down. Not today. Not when the forecast calls for wind and the landlord will be coming by for a casual visit, which is always code for let me look around and pretend this space might someday be worth more than you're paying. And you try not to think about that, because the more you think about him, the more you fantasize about chasing him down the street with a ladle full of molten wax, and while that would be satisfying, it would also mean finding a new workshop. And you don't have the energy for that kind of reinvention. So instead, you get to work. Today's task isn't glamorous. Then again, none of them are. But it's repetitive in a way that numbs the part of your brain that keeps whispering about rent and burns and failing eyesight. You're making stubby altar candles, the kind that sit in rows at the front of the church and weep wax all over the stone floor, while people kneel and pray for things that probably won't happen, but maybe it makes them feel better. Maybe the light is enough. And it's strange to think that something you made with these hands, these bruised and bandaged and blackened hands, might offer someone a few seconds of peace in the middle of whatever storm they're in. And it doesn't fix anything, but it does keep you pouring, keep you measuring and cutting and tying wicks with your good hand, while the other throbs like it's trying to remind you you're still human. And by mid-morning, the workshop is warm enough to strip off your outer layer and the frost has melted from the window, and the light that trickles in has that weak winter quality, like it's trying its best, but hasn't eaten in a few days. And you sit for a moment with your eyes closed, letting the warmth from the fire reach the parts of your back that haven't felt alive in weeks. And for a second, it's almost peaceful, until the bell above the door jingles and you freeze, because you weren't expecting anyone. And the last thing you need right now is a surprise visitor with more expectations than patience. But it's not the landlord. It's the widow from the corner house, the one with the sharp eyes and soft hands, the one who wears grief like a second skin, but still manages to smile when she talks to children, and she steps in like she's done it before, like she knows the way around the pools of wax and the slick spots on the floor, and she's holding a cloth-wrapped bundle, and she says her brother passed in the night, and she needs 6 black candles by sundown, and she's sorry for the short notice, and she knows it's a lot, and she brought what she could. And when she unwraps the bundle, you see dried apples, a jar of salt, and a little copper brooch in the shape of a bird. And it's not coin, but it's something, and something is more than most people offer. And you nod, not just because you'll do it, but because you understand. And you tell her it'll be ready, and she touches your wrist gently when she thanks you, and even though the pressure sends a bolt of pain up your arm, You don't flinch because her hand is warm and her eyes are kind. And you realize you haven't been touched like that in months, maybe longer. And when she leaves, you set the bundle aside like it's sacred, and you throw a new batch of wax in the pot without thinking, and you move faster than you should, working on instinct and memory, and that strange fire in your chest that sometimes shows up when someone needs something from you and isn't cruel about it, and you make the candles one by one blackened with soot, and patience trimmed with the kind of precision that only comes from caring too much about things most people will never notice. And when you finish, you place them in a box lined with scrap cloth and rest your hand on the lid for a second longer than necessary because you hope they bring her even an ounce of comfort. And when she comes to collect them, she doesn't say much, just presses the brooch into your palm and tells you to keep the salt for winter. And you stand there in the doorway after she leaves, staring at the brooch, watching the sun glint off the tiny wings, and for the first time in a long time you feel like maybe all this burning hasn't been entirely in vain. The sun is long gone by the time you finish cleaning the soot off the edge of the mold rack, which is a pointless exercise really, because the soot always comes back. It lives here now, married into the walls and passed down like a family curse. But you do it anyway, not because you believe in spotless tools or divine order, but because sometimes your hands need something slow and repetitive to do that. Doesn't involve flame or injury. And tonight, your hands are tired. Not just tired, but hollow tired. Like all the marrow has been melted down and stirred into the wax. And you can feel that hollowness stretching up your arms and into your shoulders, where the weight of the day has piled itself like bricks. You wipe your palms on your apron still stiff from the morning spills, still reeking of scorched tallow and old smoke. And you glance at the door, not because you expect anyone, but because the street has been too quiet for too long. The kind of quiet that makes the skin on the back of your neck prickle like it's been whispered to by something you didn't hear, and for a flicker of a moment you wonder if you locked it, not the door, but your life. If there's still a latch somewhere you forgot to fasten, that's letting things in when you're too busy pouring and trimming and surviving to notice you shake. The thought away, tell yourself it's the cold, or the burn, or the ache in your back, pretending to be dread, and you return to the bench where the last of the votives are cooling. Their little stubby forms lined up like weary soldiers, and you run a hand over them one by one to make sure the tops have settled flat, and the wicks are still centered. And for a moment, you feel proud, not loudly or dramatically, but in a small, pulsing way, like you did something good, and no one had to clap for it to matter. But then the wind picks up outside, and the whole building groans a slow, deep creak that rises from the beams like a warning sigh from something older than you, and much less impressed. And you look up at the rafters, half expecting something to be hanging there, half dreading that nothing ever will, and the wind dies down again just as fast as it came, leaving behind the heavy silence you didn't ask for, and you go back to work because you don't know what else to do. You always go back to work, and tonight that means clearing the stub box, sorting out the candle ends and partial pours, and the weird little malformed ones that never cooled right, or came out bent like arthritic fingers, and you separate the ones that can be melted down from the ones that need to be broken apart and tossed into the fire. And you realize as you're prying the base off a lopsided taper with a pair of scorched pliers that you've started muttering again, not words exactly, more like fragments of sound, half thoughts, and burnt syllables. And it's not for company, not really. It's just noise, something to remind you that you still exist outside your own head. You don't even realize what you're saying until you hear yourself repeat a name, not your own. Not someone living, but a name you haven't spoken in years. And when it falls out of your mouth, it sounds foreign, like a candle cracking in a quiet church, and you freeze for just a second, just long enough to feel that old raw edge come back, the one you keep buried under the wax and the routine and the soot. And then you keep working faster now, sharper, like if you move quickly enough, you won't feel it, won't hear it, won't remember. But the thing about memory is it doesn't care how fast you move or how well you bury it. It seeps slow and steady like smoke through a hairline crack. And you think about him, about that winter, about the candle that wouldn't burn. No matter how many times you relit the wick and you shake your head and throw the stub into the bin too hard and it clatters louder than it should. Echoes too long in the silence. And something shifts in the shadows behind the stove, just enough to make your heart skip and your feet tense. And you squint into the dark. But there's nothing there, of course. There's nothing there. Just your own fear stretching its arms again. Just the ghosts you keep feeding with every sleepless night and every quiet whisper. And you light a taper and hold it up to the shadows like a sword just to be sure. And the flame doesn't flicker, doesn't jump. Just burns slow and steady like a pulse. Like it's reminding you to breathe. And you do, you breathe in wax and smoke and memory. And you exhale. The kind of silence that only comes after a name's been spoken and left unanswered. And then you put the taper back and turn to the fire and toss in the broken candle pieces one by one, watching them melt into puddles of nothing. And as you do it, you think maybe this is what morning really looks like. Not tears or speeches or black clothes, but quiet nights in small rooms, doing the same task over and over again, hoping the repetition will stitch something back together. And it doesn't, not really. But it keeps your hands moving and your mind from turning to rot. And that's enough. Or at least it has to be, because the alternative is letting the quiet win. And the quiet has already taken enough from you. So you clean the bench, sweep the floor, hang your tools on their nails, and light one last candle. Not for him, not for you, but for the space between where you are and where he isn't. And you sit beside it with your feet on the cold stone and your wrist still throbbing and your heart beating a little too loud in your chest. And you wait for the flame to burn low because you've learned not to leave them unattended. And because maybe this one deserves to be watched all the way to the end. The candle burns down, slow, pooling into itself in lazy spirals as the flame dips and wavers and carries on anyway. And you sit there watching it like it's trying to tell you something like, if you just stare hard enough for long enough, it'll whisper the secret to surviving a life built out of soot and silence. But all it does is flicker, same as always, casting your shadow across the opposite wall, like a figure stretched too thin. And you wonder for the 100th time what you look like to anyone passing by the window right now. A hunched, wax-coated silhouette, cradling a sore wrist and staring into firelight, like it holds the meaning of existence, which it doesn't. Not really. But that hasn't stopped you from looking, because everything else that's supposed to give meaning faith. Family freedom has either left broken or never showed up in the first place. So you sit with the flame instead and let it do what it does. Best, burn itself out 1 second at a time without complaint. And the air's cold now, colder than it was earlier. Sharp at the edges and crawling through the cracks like a thief. and you wrap your arms around yourself, not because it helps, but because it feels like the right gesture. When the world is this quiet, when the night starts to feel like it's closing in with questions you're too tired to answer, and eventually you stand up, because the cold is starting to win, and your legs have begun that dull humming ache that means if you don't move now, you won't move at all, and you blow out the candle with one breath and whisper thank you to nobody in particular. Maybe to the wax, maybe to yourself, maybe to some version of you that used to believe in bigger things, and then you start closing down the workshop, snuffing the lamps, brushing wax flakes into a tin, covering the tools with ragged cloth that doesn't protect them from rust, but makes you feel like you tried, and you're halfway to the stairs when the door creaks open. Without warning, just a slow dragging groan followed by a gust of wind that smells like old rain and wet stone. And you freeze, not out of fear exactly, but from that same instinct that makes animals go still. When something shifts too far outside the pattern, and for a heartbeat the doorway is just empty space and wind, and then there's someone standing there, a man or something shaped like one, hooded and broad and carrying a basket in one hand and a silence in the other, and you can't see his face, just the glint of something pale under the hood, and the way his shoulders fill the frame like he's more shadow than flesh. And you think about saying something, anything, but your voice has gone dry and your brain's still catching up. And before you can decide whether to speak or shut the door or run or throw a candle at him, he steps forward and sets the basket down without crossing the threshold. And in a voice low and even, he says, "He heard you make good candles," and you nod slowly, because this doesn't feel like the kind of moment where you lie. And he says he needs one, just one, but it has to be perfect, has to burn all night without going out, and he'll pay well. And you squint through the dim and ask what kind of candle, and he says for watching, and the way he says it makes your spine tighten like the word has too many meanings now. And you glance at the basket and see inside a small jar of honey, a folded cloth and something wrapped in twine that smells like myrrh, and it's payment. You realize weird but fair old school barter, with things that still matter when coin doesn't. And you nod again, because what else are you going to do? And when you look up to ask when he needs it, he's already gone, like the wind swallowed him, or the night took him back, and the door is swinging slightly, and the cold is in your teeth, and you pull the basket inside and lock the bolt without thinking, fingers moving on the instinct, and you carry it to the bench and set it down, like it might be cursed, which it probably is. But you don't believe in curses anymore, just in work, and you sit down and unwrap the twine and open the cloth, and find a tiny carved figurine of a bird, maybe a crow, maybe something older, its wings outspread and etched with patterns you don't recognize, and you set it beside the honey, and you say okay out loud just to hear your own voice again, and you start melting the wax this time. Not just tallow or beeswax, but a mix you've never used before, a little from the chapel supply, a little from the widow's leftover batch, a little of the crumbly resin you found in the crate behind the stove, and you stir it slow and steady, watching it shift from cloudy to golden to clear, and the whole workshop smells like old churches and burned flowers, and something sharp underneath, and you don't know what kind of watching this candle is meant for, but you pour it with more care than you've given anything in weeks. Trim the wick to a point, carve a thin ring around the base like a seal, and when it sets, you wrap it in a square of linen and tie it with the same twine he used and place it back in the basket and set it by the door, and you wait because you know he'll come back or something will. And sure enough, just before the flame in your final wall lamp burns out, there's a knock, soft but heavy, like someone tapping with a ring or a bone, and you open the door without flinching this time, and no one's there, just the empty night and the basket gone. And on the ground where it sat is a single coin, heavy and stamped with a symbol you've never seen. And you pick it up and hold it in your palm, and for a second it feels warm, and then it doesn't, and you close the door and lock it and go back to the bench and sit in the dark and tell yourself, this is just another job, just another night, just another candle that will burn itself down while someone stares at it too long. But your heart beats faster anyway, and you don't light another flame. Not tonight, because for the first time in years, you're not sure you want to see what's watching you back. You wake to silence, not the soft, sleepy kind that comes with early morning stillness, or the temporary hush of a town between bells, but the deep, wrong kind, the kind that wraps around your ears like wool soaked in ice water, thick and pressing and too complete. The kind that makes your skin crawl before your brain catches up. And when you sit up from your sleeping mat with a spine that crackles like burnt parchment, the world feels heavier, not in a metaphorical sense, but in a literal, suffocating way, like someone layered the air with ash and regret while you slept. Like something crawled in overnight and sat on your chest and whispered your name until your dreams forgot how to end, and your first breath tastes stale and burnt, and your mouth is dry as lint, and you blink at the window expecting some hint of dawn. But the glass is black, darker than night should be. No frost, no stars, no reflection, just a wall of void looking back at you, like it's waiting to be let in, and your hand reaches for the lantern without thinking, half from habit, half from dread. And when you light the flame, it catches too fast, flaring up with a snap, like the wick was soaked in something alive. And the shadows scatter in ways that make you feel like you startled them, like they were gathered close and whispering, and you interrupted something ancient, something that doesn't forgive. And your workshop looks wrong in this light too long, in places too narrow in others, like the corners have shifted and the beams have bent while you slept, and you tell yourself it's nothing, it's the hour, it's the stiffness in your joints, it's your mind playing tricks because your bones still ache from the cold and your burned wrist is pulsing again, and the sleep you got didn't stick, just floated somewhere shallow and dark and useless. And you go to the firebox and start the morning routine. If it even is morning, stacking the splinters and the wax scraps and striking the flint with hands that feel clumsier than usual, slower, more disconnected from the rest of you, like they've got their own opinions about what's about to happen. And when the fire catches, it crackles wrong. Not loud, not soft, just off, like a voice imitating a fire, instead of a fire being a fire. And you glance around again, feeling like the walls have moved closer by a finger's width, maybe two, and then you shake your head and open the tallow barrel and get to work. Because the only thing worse than dread is idle dread. Dread without motion. Dread that breeds in the stillness like rot in a damp cellar. And you start pouring slow and measured, the same process as always. Mold, fill, trim, cool. But every part of it feels like you're being watched. Not by a person, not by something with a body, but by the air itself, by the very shape of the room, like the boards under your feet are holding their breath, and the walls are listening, and the candle from last night still lingers in your mind, the one the man perfect one, the watching one. And you don't know why, but something about that transaction has clung to you like soot under the fingernails. Something about the way he never came back, but still took what he needed about the coin he left behind, that's now wrapped in linen and buried beneath a pile of spare wicks. Because you couldn't bring yourself to throw it away, but you also couldn't bear to keep looking at it. And every time your thoughts drift too close to it, something in your chest squeezes tight, like a hand curling into a fist. And maybe it's nothing, maybe it's everything, but either way, it's part of you now. Just like the burns and the calluses and the smell that never leaves your hair, no matter how many times you wash it with boiled rainwater and soap. That's more lie than lather, and you keep working even as the room grows colder instead of warmer, even as your breath starts fogging in front of your face, even as the flame in the lantern shrinks down to a pinprick, despite fresh oil and a trimmed wick. And you tell yourself it's just the season, just the weather, just your body reacting to one too many nights on stone and one too few meals with anything green in them. And then, just as you set a fresh mold to cool, you hear something fall in the back room, a small sharp clatter like metal on stone, and you freeze because you know exactly what's back there. And it's not much, not anything that should fall on its own, and you wait, holding still like a creature that's already been spotted, but hasn't been lunged at yet. And when nothing follows, not a voice, not a footstep, not a sound, you move toward the curtain with slow, deliberate steps, candle in one hand, heart in the other. And when you pull the curtain aside, you find the coin, the wrapped coin sitting on the table where it absolutely was not a moment ago, unwrapped and gleaming with a soft, cold light that doesn't come from any flame, you know. And next to it is a taper, one of yours unlit but blackened at the tip, like it's already burned and come back, and you stare at both without moving, without breathing, until something inside you snaps. Not loudly, not violently, but with the soft break of a thread that's been fraying for years, and you whisper to the room, to the coin, to the taper, to yourself, what do you want? And for a long time, there's nothing, just the sound of the fire eating its own tongue, and the drip of wax from a forgotten mold. And then the flame in your hand flickers once, twice, and steadies, and you feel it. Not a voice, not words, but a pressure in the air that settles behind your eyes and says without saying that you are part of something. Now that your light has been seen, chosen, counted, and all you can do is stand there holding a candle that burns for both of you and wonder how many more nights you have before the wax runs out. You don't remember how long you stood there staring at the coin and the candle, only that the heat in your hand had gone out and your legs had gone numb, and when you finally moved, it was like walking through molasses, slow and deliberate and slightly detached, like your body was still trying to convince itself this wasn't happening, that maybe you'd dreamed it, maybe you'd fallen asleep at the bench again, and the fire had gone too low, and the shadows had grown too long, and your mind had slipped through the cracks of the night like wax into a crooked mold. But the coin is real cold and heavy and smooth as river stone, and the taper is still there too, just sitting in the center of the table with its burned tip curled like a black tongue. And even though you don't light it, you swear it smells faintly of smoke. Not the greasy kind you're used to, but something older, something woodsy and sharp, like burned herbs or incense, like the kind they use in places where people go to talk to the dead or gods, or whatever it is that listens when no one else does. And you pick up the coin again just to feel its weight, and it hums against your skin, not literally, not audibly, but deep down in your palm, in your chest, in the soft part of your spine that always aches when storms are coming, and you think about hiding it again. Well, what would be the point? It came back once, it'll come back again. Maybe that's what it's for, not to be buried or forgotten, but to be carried, kept held like a flame you don't understand, but know better than to let go of. And the more you stare at it, the more you realize it's not made of anything you've seen before. Not gold, not brass, not pewter. It's too pale, too dense, too quiet somehow. And etched into the center is a mark that shifts when you try to focus on it, like your eyes refuse to agree on what they're seeing. Sometimes a bird, sometimes a tree, sometimes something that feels like teeth. And you finally set it down again because your hands are starting to shake and you don't want to drop it. Not because it would break, but because it wouldn't. And that feels worse. So you wrap it back in the linen and place it gently in your coat pocket. Not to hide it, just to carry it somewhere that isn't your hands. And then you look at the taper again, and for reasons you don't entirely understand, you pick it up and carry it back into the main workshop and place it on the shelf beside your tools, like it belongs there, like it's always been there. And then you light another candle, a regular one. This time, plain beeswax, no markings, no mystery, and you get back to work, because that's all there is, really. The work, the same motions, the same routines. And if the air feels heavier now, if the shadows seem more attentive, if the fire pops a little louder, when you speak aloud to no one in particular, well, maybe that's just how things are now. Maybe the world's always been watching, and you've only just noticed. Maybe you were always meant to be the keeper of small flames and stranger favors. And so you pour and scrape and trim, like you always have, like you always will, but with one ear tilted slightly toward the rafters and one eye on the corners of the room where the light doesn't quite reach, and the hours pass strangely, not faster, not slower, just crooked like time itself has taken on the same tilt as your old mold rack. And by the time the bells ring from the church down the road, you realize the sun is out again, though it doesn't feel like morning, doesn't feel like anything, but a grey smear across the edge of the sky that might as well be dusk wearing a different face. And you open the door for some fresh air, and instead get a blast of wind that smells like frozen iron and chimney soot, and somewhere far off someone burning something they don't want to explain. And you lean in the doorway for a while, watching the street, watching the people move, like they're trying to pretend today isn't different, that something hasn't shifted, and maybe it hasn't for them. Maybe they didn't wake to silence and strange coins and candles that burn twice. Maybe they're just trying to get through the cold like always. And maybe you are too. Only now there's this weight in your pocket, and a flame in your thoughts, and a strange clarity in the way your hands move, like you're being guided. Not forced, but nudged like a current you didn't know you were in, finally pulling you downstream and around. Midday the widow returns, not with a new order, not with food, not with news, just her quiet self wrapped in too many scarves and eyes that look even more tired than yours. And she asks if you're all right, just like that, like she knows. And you pause too long before saying yes, and she nods, like she knows you're lying, and she doesn't press. Just sets down a small jar of dried herbs and tells you it's good for the lungs, and maybe for the dreams too. And you thank her, because it's the first real kindness anyone's offered you today. And when she leaves, you don't close the door right away. You just stand there holding the jar and thinking about all the things you haven't said out loud to her, to yourself, to whatever's been paying attention lately, and you place the jar on the shelf next to the taper, and they sit there together, quiet and unassuming, and you think maybe you'll light the taper tonight. Not out of fear, not out of obedience, just to see what it does, to see how it burns. And maybe when it's burning, you'll speak to it. Not with questions, not with demands, just with presence. Because you're starting to think maybe that's all it wants. Maybe that's all any of it wants, to be seen, to be made, to be burned into something. Someone remembers even after the wax has run down and the wick has curled into ash. You spend the rest of the day caught in that strange space between routine and reverence, where every motion feels like it's being watched, not by eyes, but by intention. Like the room is holding its breath while you carve and pour and trim with a little more care than usual, and maybe a little more fear too, because the taper on the shelf hasn't moved, hasn't burned, hasn't done anything but exist, and still it feels like the center of the room, like everything else is quietly orbiting it, your tools, your thoughts. Even the flame in the stove that usually sputters and huffs with its own cranky personality seems to burn steadier today, quieter, like it's trying not to interrupt. And when you catch yourself whispering to the wax as it melts, phrases like almost there and just a little longer, you don't stop yourself anymore. You just let the words spill out like they've been waiting. Because maybe that's part of the job now too. Not just shaping wax, but shaping space, shaping silence, shaping time into something that listens back. And when dusk finally settles in, not sharply, but like a soft shawl being draped across the town, you feel it in your teeth before you see it. The shift, the cooling, the way the air leans in and gets heavier without darkening too fast. And you know, this is the hour. This is when things come clearer or come apart. So you wipe down the bench with slow circles, sweep the curls of wick from the floor, and go to the shelf where the taper still sits beside the jar of herbs. And you pick it up with hands that are clean but still stained. And you walk it to the center of the room and place it on a little saucer. Not because it needs one, but because it feels respectful, and you light it with a match. Not from the stove, not from another candle, but fresh flame, clean strike. And when it catches, the flame doesn't flare or pop or dance. It just glows steady and soft like it's been lit before, and is glad to be lit again. And the room changes with it, just slightly, just enough that the shadows stop moving and the walls seem to exhale. And you sit across from it and watch it burn. And the silence this time isn't heavy. It's warm, like a hand pressed gently to your chest, reminding you to breathe. And so you do, slow and deep, and you let your thoughts unspool, let yourself drift. And in that quiet, you remember things you didn't mean to remember. Faces and voices and nights that smelled like firewood and boiled meat. The way your brother used to hum when he worked the first time you held a carving knife without slicing your thumb open. The way your mother laughed, like it was a secret she trusted you with. And all of it floats around the flame like smoke that doesn't need to escape. And you sit there until your eyes grow heavy and your back slouches and your shoulders stop arguing with the weight of the day. And you know, it's time to let the candle do what it came here to do. So you dim the lamps, stoke the stove just once more for warmth, and roll out your mat in the corner, where it's quietest. And you lie down, still watching the flame, and it watches back without flickering. And as your eyes slip closed, you feel like maybe, just maybe, you've done enough today, made enough, given enough. And that's the strange miracle of it. Not that the candle changed anything, but that it reminded you. You could still feel something real, and that's more than enough for one night. And as the room darkens gently, and the wind outside softens to a sigh, you let yourself drift with it. Let yourself rest because you've earned it. And tomorrow will come, and it will bring light, and it will bring work, and it will bring something new and strange and full of quiet wonder. And you will meet it with steady hands and tired eyes, and the memory of tonight's small flame still warming the space between your ribs. So good night, sleep easy, and remember that tomorrow will be a brighter day, a steady day, a good day to learn and to build and to carry the light forward, one breath at a time.